Game Boy World, and this is World Bowling? Real-world sports and sports-like games have long been one of the most popular subjects for video games. Seeing them converted into the limited framework of the Game Boy really drives home just how difficult it is to pull off such a project. Last time we looked at a Game Boy pinball game that missed the mark, and now here's an equally iffy game about bowling. Romstar's World Bowling, originally developed by lower mid-tier Japanese studio Athena, takes on the somewhat strange ambition of turning bowling into a video game. Now, I won't say I don't get the appeal of bowling, it can be pretty fun, but the point of bowling is not the sport itself, if you could even call it that. Lobbing a 12-pound ball toward a bunch of pins makes for an amusing display of machismo, sure. Plus, it's an excuse to wear an ugly shirt and rental shoes, and who doesn't love that? But no, most people bowl not because they love the game itself, which is barely one step above miniature golf in terms of athletic exertion, but because of the experience, the chance to hang out with friends, enjoy a little friendly competition with those guys in the other ugly shirts, the beer. It's things like those that make bowling so entertaining, that justify the funky smell of the borrowed shoes and the weird sticky residue inside the finger holes of the ball, and that one manic army vet who takes the game way too seriously for anyone's well-being. None of these factors, though, translate into a video game adaptation of bowling. No, World Bowling strips out the hanging around and the beer and the physicality of bowling, reducing the entire experience down to a trio of meters. You line up your position, determine your aim, and select the force with which you release the ball. And that's the sum total of World Bowling. Well, almost. You do have an opportunity at the outset of the game to select a bowler, a right-handed boy or a left-handed girl, and the weight of your ball. And these factors do come into play as permanent modifiers. Ball weight doesn't have much impact, lighter balls seem less likely to knock down a full set than a heavier ball, basically. But your favorite hand is definitely a factor. Both the male and female bowlers are effectively equal in terms of strength, but their dominant hand determines the direction and bias of your rolls. Once you set out to bowl, each frame works more or less like a hole of Nintendo's golf, with its emphasis on angles and meters. You line up your bowler along the little arrows at the foul line, determine the direction of your roll from a meter that bounces left and right, and set your power with a second meter. And that's pretty much it for the game. This is as no frills a take on bowling as it gets. And it's hard as hell. The name World Bowling comes from the fact that you can bowl in lanes across the globe, but in order to do so, you need to score above a certain threshold in each lane. The thing is, those score requirements are absolutely insane. The very first lane you play, Japan, has a minimum score of 200. That means in order to advance to the second round, you need to bowl better than spares every single frame. The worst you're allowed to do here would be to bowl a spare every single frame, hitting 9 pins on the first ball, and picking up a leftover on the second, then rolling a strike on the final bonus frame. It's quite a demand, and each location only gets harsher. Unfortunately, real-world bowling skill doesn't factor in here much. Sure, it's important to understand how your character's dominant hand relates to the optimal angles, but really, it's about being able to hit those speedy little meters at just the right spot every single time. They move quickly, and ultimately I found using visual cues to be less effective than timing rolls based on the meter's audio cues. And even then, it all seems kind of iffy. The over-the-shoulder visual perspective admittedly doesn't help. The balls and pins kind of float in limbo. And while the ball scales down to imitate vanishing down the lane, it feels pretty inconsistent. As with our last game, Hero Shugo Pinball Party, the ball's collision physics can be pretty frustrating. It may look like you've hit a pin, but sometimes the ball sprite will pass right through a pin sprite without scoring a hit. On the other hand, sometimes it'll seemingly miss by a pixel or two and still count as a hit. And forget about picking up splits or even taking out 7 or 10 pins by rolling into the front pins on a bungled first ball. World Bowling doesn't exactly have high-end physics modeling, and pulling off sophisticated rolls isn't really possible here. I guess maybe it was foolish of me to expect better. There's only so much you can do with the Game Boy after all. Still, bowling games was kind of Athena's stock in trade. They produced something like 6 bowling titles in roughly 10 years, including one of the 2 bowling games to appear on Virtual Boy. But World Bowling feels like a rough sketch for all these later games, an interesting but incomplete take on the subject. In fairness, this was Athena's first bowling game, and everyone has to start somewhere. One would hope that they improved over time. Still, it's kind of surprising that World Bowling proved a rewarding enough well to return to so many times. Maybe being picked up for international distribution by Romstar made the difference. And so World Bowling represents the beginning of a very minor video game bowling dynasty, the tiny acorn from which an insignificant little oak would eventually sprout. For more Bush League psych-out stuff, keep reading GameBoyWorld.com.